Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight, we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. A place before clocks, before kings, even before the humble sock. We drift into the flickering firelight of our most ancient ancestors, whose dinner conversations were somewhat limited, mostly grunted, and occasionally, well, human-flavored. Oh yes, cannibalism. But don't worry, this story is more curiosity than horror, more lullaby than lecture. So fluff your pillow like a Neanderthal might fluff a mammoth pelt, and press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Now, let's settle into the warm mist of prehistory, when Homo sapiens were just getting the hang of sitting around fires and wondering whether Barry from the next cave was looking at them weird. You see, once upon a very, very long time ago, long before food delivery apps and mid-century casseroles, humans dined based on availability. Berries, good. Mammoth, excellent if you could catch one. Other humans, well, only under special circumstances. Ritualistic cannibalism? It sounds frightfully dramatic, doesn't it? Like something performed by torchlight under a blood moon, with chanting, skulls, and someone wearing far too many feathers. But truthfully, it was often far more mundane, and in some cases, surprisingly sentimental. Let me take you to Guff's Cave, set in the sleepy limestone folds of Somerset, England. Humans were living there over 15,000 years ago. Yes, right where you might now find cream teas and rain-washed sheep. Excavations in the cave revealed human bones. Skulls turned into drinking cups, long bones cracked open for the fatty marrow inside. Morbid, a bit. But it may not have been about hunger alone. The butchery was so careful, so methodical, that archaeologists believe it was a ritual, a somber farewell to the dead, possibly meant to absorb their spirit, their wisdom, maybe even their parking space in the afterlife. In some cultures, eating one's kin was seen as an act of love. And let's face it, ancient humanity didn't have a lot of ways to say goodbye. No floral arrangements, no framed photos, no bouncy funeral playlists. For some, eating a relative meant keeping a part of them close forever, quite literally, digestively speaking. Of course, not every prehistoric society got sentimental with supper. Some just got practical. Protein is protein after all, and in the chilly caves and grasslands of the Ice Age, food could be scarce, and the dinner menu was alarmingly flexible. Imagine sitting down after a long hunt, only to realize the tastiest food nearby had a name like Greg. Tough times. But even then, there was often a ritual to it. Ceremonial cutting patterns, specific bones laid out in sacred formations, skulls polished and displayed like ancient family portraits, only more bony. Meanwhile, across the globe, similar stories unfolded. In El Cedron Cave in Spain, Neanderthal bones were found with signs of butchery, not of punishment or war, but consumption. These weren't victims of attack. They were part of the group, possibly family, eaten after death when survival required it. There's something hauntingly gentle in the idea. Not savagery, but sorrow. They're not devouring in rage. They're mourning through mastication. Now, don't worry. This isn't heading toward gory details. We're treading soft-footed through the echoes of time. Think of it like walking barefoot through sand that's warm from an ancient sun. The world back then wasn't necessarily barbaric, just differently desperate, and sometimes delightfully weird. When the options were eat to survive or starve politely, etiquette took a nap. It's hard not to admire the quiet pragmatism of our ancestors. They didn't have much, but they made meaning where they could. From stones, from smells, and yes, from meals that we'd now consider highly illegal in at least 200 jurisdictions. Still, these practices weren't as wild as you'd think. They existed inside frameworks of belief, ways of understanding life, death, and what comes next. You didn't eat Uncle Yorick because you were a maniac. You did it because the tribe taught you it was a sacred bond, a passing of the flame, a chewing of the eternal bone. And what if, just what if, some of those harmonies still linger in the human psyche? In the way we ritualize grief, in the odd reverence we give to last meals and final words, in the comfort we take from sitting together at a table. Maybe somewhere deep in the rustle of our DNA, echoes remain of fireside farewells. The fire is crackling low now. The mist outside thickens. A soft mammoth wind presses against the ancient tent flap of time. Tomorrow, we'll journey to a land of stepped pyramids and spicy offerings. Empires whose gods had surprisingly specific dietary preferences. But for now, rest easy. You're not on the menu. Let's slip into the velvet folds of history's most misunderstood supper party. The flute of time plays softly in the background as we find ourselves gliding across the jungle canopy of ancient Mesoamerica. The night sky here is lacquer black, studded with stars like sequins on the robe of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who never missed a good ceremonial feast. Down below, torches flicker across stone temples, casting shadows longer than the empires they inhabit. The scent of copal incense coils through the air like a sleepy cat. It smells of old stories and half-forgotten prayers. Tonight, the gods are hungry. Now, before we rush to judgment, because that's exhausting, and we are here to drift, not dash, let us remember, context is everything. To the Aztecs and their neighboring cultures, eating someone wasn't always odious. Sometimes it was downright divine. Not so much dinner as a devotion. Picture the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, gleaming under the sun like a pyramid-shaped sundial pointing right at your afterlife. Here, priests in resplendent feathered robes conducted rituals so elaborate they'd make a soap opera look like a library visit. Heart extractions, ceremonial chanting, music made with instruments shaped like skulls. And sometimes, just sometimes, rarely mind, there was a part 2 to the ceremony. A rather digestible one. That's right. In certain high ceremonies, the limbs of a sacrificed warrior, usually an honored enemy, not just some poor villager who forgot to pay his maize tax, were distributed among the elite like divine doggy bags. The nobility consumed the flesh not out of hunger, but to absorb spiritual qualities, courage, bravery, the occasional tendon. But let's rewind our sleepy reel and taxi slowly toward the ethereal concept itself. What compelled these societies to intertwine food with faith in such macabre ways? To Mesoamerican belief systems, the gods had once sacrificed themselves to create the world. Life existed because they gave themselves, their blood, their bones, freshly divine deli meat for creation. Therefore, the entire cosmos ran on a kind of sacred reciprocity. Humans had to keep the celestial lights on. The gods' stomachs were metaphorical, yes, but also quite literally in need of feeding. Sacrifice, ritual, beautiful, frightful, was a thank you note written in crimson calligraphy to those divine beings. And occasionally, human flesh became the ink. But don't imagine some grisly buffet. In fact, the consumption was often symbolic and strictly limited. It wasn't strangers hopping into line with paper plates. It was highly ritualized, and surprisingly, respectful. The priest might carve up the sacred meat. Again, try not to picture this too literally. It's bedtime. But only the most honored members of society might partake. It wasn't a meal. It was communion. The act was dense with meaning. To share flesh with the gods was to echo their primordial sacrifice. It was a way of affirming cosmic order, like resetting the universe's alarm clock. And ironically, it revealed a deep reverence for life. To honor someone this fully, by raising their body to a sacred status, was beyond fanfare. It was theological gourmet. There's humor in the solemnity too, like a trumpet dropped in a cathedral. The Spanish conquistadors, upon witnessing these rituals, were horrified. They wrote in their letters back to Europe things like, "We came for gold, and instead found tapas made of men." Which, yeah, understandable reaction. But these same conquistadors had spent centuries burning heretics and seasoning crusades with spice and steel. Perspective, dear sleepyhead, is a merry prism. Depending on the angle, it either sharpens the image or refracts it delightfully, until nothing quite makes sense. A wonderful condition for sleep, really. Now, we float back from Tenochtitlan, the grand capital with its floating gardens and temple steps stained with stories. As we drift, we're left with a single dreamy question. What threads of sacrifice and sanctity weave through cultures far apart, yet strangely alike? The moon is climbing, slow and full, and the jungle below hums with frogs and ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden drum beats like a heart remembering its lines. Let your eyelids fall like dusk over the rainforest, and come with me soon as we follow the aroma of ancient reverence farther afield, toward the highlands and the hidden lands of the Andes. Close your eyes, unless you're already halfway there, and picture a flickering fire under the slow sky of long-ago Peru. The Andes loom like sleeping giants, their backs frosted with snow. A small stone village hugs the mountain's edge, where the air is thin and the stories are thick. Here, in the woven shadow of empire and sky, lived the Moche. Ah yes, the Moche, an ancient civilization that blossomed in northern Peru, well before anyone had figured out forks. These were no mere cave dwellers. The Moche crafted fine ceramics, built vast irrigation systems, and, they say with slightly raised scholarly eyebrows, may have dabbled in ritualistic cannibalism. Now before you clutch your blanket in mock horror, remember, this wasn't mindless munching. It wasn't even mealtime mischief. No. This was sacred, symbolic, and deeply ceremonial. Or, as some dreamy historians like to put it, digesting divinity. The Moche weren't writing novels or keeping diaries, which makes things rather breezy for historians and maddening for sleep-deprived archaeologists. Most of what we know comes from their extraordinary pottery. These ceramic vessels are not only stunning, they're also vividly decorated with images, not floral patterns, as you might find on your grandmother's china, but elaborate scenes that often include warriors, prisoners, and, well, a hint of a post-battle buffet. In one particularly intricate scene, victorious Moche elites appeared to be drinking from what looked like human skull cups. Now, before you grimace, know that such things were not terribly uncommon in the ancient world. And, archaeologically speaking, blood for the gods was a pretty standard festive cocktail. But were the Moche really eating human flesh as part of spiritual expression? Or were they just artistic pranksters messing with the future? Well, a bit of column A, a whisper of column B. You see, the Moche believed that power could be transferred, absorbed even, through ritual acts. Consuming a fallen enemy wasn't an act of spiteful violence. It was a kind of spiritual recycling. Imagine being so profoundly devoted to the gods that you'd consume your rival's courage, bite by symbolic bite, all while believing that the strength, bravery, and even divine favor of the enemy could live on within you. At least they were being sustainable. Now, the Moche didn't write down a FAQ about their feasts, but we have bones, and bones, dear listener, don't lie. Excavations have uncovered remains showing cut-off marks and signs of flesh removal, suggesting more than just a reckless butcher job. The bones knew things, quiet things, tasty things. Still, we cozy narrators must practice restraint. There are those who argue that the Moche scenes could have been metaphorical, representations of spiritual ideas rather than literal events. Much like how modern films depict time travel without assuming all directors own a flux capacitor. But evidence mounts, as evidence tends to do when it's been underground too long. There's a temple complex deep in southern Peru called Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon. There, in layers stratified like history's own lasagna, archaeologists found human remains that suggest sacrificial rituals occurred over centuries. Cut marks, displacement, even exposure to fire. And in this dreamy moon temple, it becomes harder to dismiss the possibility that ritual cannibalism or symbolic consumption was part of a sacred continuum, one that merged death, honor, and cosmic realignment with maybe a touch of dining. Even now, it's hard to decipher whether those elite Moche were truly hosting flesh-forward feasts, or rather performing ceremonial rites that involved a symbolic act taken quite literally over time. After all, one culture's sacred metaphor is another archaeologist's headline. To the Moche, it seems, life was full of cycles, birth and death, rain and drought, feast and famine. Perhaps, within this eternal rhythm, consuming the conquered was just another way of knitting themselves into the great cosmic loom. A way to make sure no courage went to waste, no strength unshared. So, if somewhere in a long ago mountain mist, a shaman once raised a skull cup high, toasted to the rain gods, and took a sip of symbolic fortitude, we do not judge. We simply nod respectfully, adjust our pillows, and appreciate the poetry of it all. Now, drift gently with that thought, dear listener, because in another ancient world, across an ocean and a sundown, a very different civilization had their own peculiar palette for piety. Curling close, dear dream navigator, and let the balmy wind of antiquity ruffle your ethereal pajamas. Tonight, we find ourselves reclining somewhere between epic verse and olive groves as we peer into the age of Homeric Greece, a time when gods stomped across mountain tops, warriors sulked in tents, and sacrifices came with a considerable helping of smoke, song, and sizzling flesh. Ah, the Greeks, ever the dramatists, even a mundane offering came wrapped in verse and libation. But what happens when a sacrifice grows so grand, so outrageously over the top, that it's practically a barbecue for Olympus? Enter the hecatomb. The word hecatomb, which sounds like the name of a forgotten IKEA armchair, actually means 100 oxen. That's right, 100. Not one, not three, not even a well-marbled dozen. No. A hecatomb was the ultimate bovine bonanza, a theatrical buffet for the gods, particularly the ones with a taste for burnt offerings and the scent of singed heroism. Imagine the scene: a dusky grove outside the city walls, a sea of reflective bronze armor, priests in white linen fussing with garlands, musicians trying to tune lyres valiantly, while cattle unhealthily moo their counter-opinions. And there, lined up with noble resignation, are 100 oxen. Or, let's be historically honest here, 97 oxen a moody bull that kicks, and 2 suspiciously large goats someone snuck in from a cousin's farm. What followed was a delicate, if rather smoky, ritual. The animals were slaughtered with solemn song, their thigh bones carefully wrapped in fat and burnt upon the altar. The gods, it was assumed, adored this fat-wrapped flame bouquet, a celestial snack, if you will. Meanwhile, the rest of the meat was, with no sense of irony, roasted and distributed among the people in a cheerful orgy of feasting. Devotion and digestion, hand in hand. Now, was this cannibalism? Not quite. But here's where the warm toga of myth begins to wrinkle. You see, the Greeks had memories, dim, myth-soaked memories, of a time when things were more crunchy. Tales whispered at symposiums spoke of ancient kings who offered not just bulls, but boys. Most notably, a certain King Lycaon, who upon suspecting Zeus had come to his palace in human guise, chose the most logical path of hospitality. He cooked and served the god a dish made of a dismembered child. Yes, really. The ancient Greek version of "Can I offer you something to eat?" took a very unsanitary turn. Zeus, either outraged or undercooked, transformed Lycaon into a wolf on the spot. Thus, myth gave us the werewolf, and a very strong reminder to always label your leftovers. Though this tale hums with metaphor, perhaps about savagery, perhaps about hospitality gone wrong, it also pokes at a curious cultural memory. Were there, once upon a darker Homeric dawn, rituals where human flesh made an appearance beside the grilled goats and ceremonial wine? Well, archaeologists have debated this for decades. Human bones discovered amid hearths could indicate sacrifice, or just a rather chaotic dinner party. Greek poets, being poets, often exaggerated for flair, but the whispers of older rites linger just beneath the surface, like the low bass notes of a funeral dirge played on an ancient lyre. The Greeks themselves certainly seem to think their predecessors were wild things. By the time of Plato and his Eurogliding logic, human sacrifice was frowned upon as a barbaric relic, something only fringe cults or foreign lands dabbled in. The Olympian gods, now fully bourgeoisie, preferred their devotions tidy, theatrical, and preferably involving roast lamb with a side of poetry. Still, the memory endured, in myths, in metaphor, and in the slightly overcooked meat of religious ceremonies. The sizzle of fat on bone was more than just a snack for the divine. It was a smoky thread connecting mortals to myth and feast to fright. As twilight gently rolls across the slopes of the ancient Peloponnese, let your thoughts unfurl like incense smoke at a peaceful outdoor altar. The crackling flames, the honeyed wine, the stubborn goats disguised as oxen. It's all part of a sacred theatre, half feast, half firelight dream. And next, we'll drift even earlier still, beyond the olive trees and archaeological certainty, to a temple so ancient its stones still murmur. But for now, breathe deep and feel the haze of the hecatomb settle around you like a soft fleece cloak. The gods are fed, the fire is low. Let sleep taste sweet as nectar. Picture this: fog rolling softly over damp moors, a circle of moss-covered stones, and the faint sound of a goat somewhere in the distance, probably contemplating its role in dinner. Welcome to ancient Europe, where the nights were long, the fires were warm, and sometimes the gods were invited to supper, with parts of you on the menu. By now, you may be wondering how or why such a thing could happen in the candlelit flicker of early civilization. But rest assured, these were not ordinary dinner parties. They were spiritual, deeply symbolic, and most importantly, seasonal. In many ancient European cultures, Ritual feasting was as regular as cold winters, and almost always spiritual. The Celts, for instance, threw banquets to rival any modern holiday spread, complete with roasted meats, flowing mead, and the occasional whisper of sacrificial rites. Yes, delightful. Now, to be clear, not every festival involved a dramatic finale. Most were cozy affairs steeped in symbolism, stories, and perhaps a slight misunderstanding of human anatomy. But tucked away in some mythological corners and archaeological oddities, there are hints, just hints, that human flesh may occasionally have mingled among the lamb chops and barley stew. Take the bogs of Northern Europe, nature's handy time capsules. Archaeologists have found what we lovingly call bog bodies, perfectly preserved individuals who appear to have met an untimely end about 2,000 years ago. Some show signs of trauma, like having been strangled, stabbed, and then very politely submerged in a peat bog. Murder? Maybe. Ritual sacrifice? Quite possibly. Dinner guest? Debatable. One figure among them, the famous Tolland man of Denmark, was so meticulously preserved by the peat that scientists could analyze his last meal, porridge with seeds. No paprika, tragically, but there's no evidence that Tolland man was eaten. That distinction belongs perhaps to more shadowy gatherings. Let's tiptoe to Central Europe now, to a site called Herxheim, near modern-day Germany. Over 6,000 years ago, in the linear pottery culture, a civilization known primarily for, yes, pottery, archaeologists found piles of butchered human bones among the remains of communal gatherings. Some skulls were cleanly split, and jawbones collected separately, as if curated for a cryptic charcuterie board. Now, keep your nightcap on. There's debate among historians about whether this was ritual cannibalism, defensive dismemberment for warfare's sake, or simply a very rustic recycling program. Either way, the vibe, ghoulish gourmet. Scholars have gently bickered over translations, but ancient texts suggest that some feast gatherings may have included ceremonial representations of gods consuming flesh. And if you've ever tried to write a metaphor in stone, you know how easily things get misinterpreted. Offer a piece of yourself to the gods, they wrote. Figuratively? Well, not always. Of course, most feasts involved nothing more sinister than boiled oats and elk ribs. The Germanic tribes, ever fond of a good mead-fueled dance, celebrated harvest festivals with animal offerings, drinking horns, and heroic shout-singing that could have easily summoned either Odin or a noise complaint. Their rituals took place in sacred groves, under starlit canopies laced with the scent of pine and wood smoke. A beautiful backdrop for an evening of storytelling, sacrifice, and probable hangovers. And far to the north, the early Norse folk may have held blot, ritual feasts involving the symbolic offering of blood to appease the gods. Unlike a Netflix potluck, these required a friendly local animal, or in rare circumstances, possibly a human, to donate their body for divine attention. The blood was smeared on idols, the meat cooked in cauldrons, and the mead forever flowing. It was a deeply reverent atmosphere, but one that to modern eyes may seem more chilling than charming. Still, within these ancient gatherings, what we see again and again is a longing, a need to commune with something greater, whether through symbolic consumption or actual, well, dining. These rituals offered early peoples a way to make sense of death, the harvest, and the mysterious turning of the seasons. Ritual cannibalism, if it occurred, was rarely about appetite. It was about transcendence, transformation, and maybe a bit of theatrical flair. As our fire crackles softly and the mists settle once more over those dreamy European hills, we leave behind the haunted fest halls of ancient tribes. For now, dear listener, sip your mental mead and wrap yourself in the idea that even the darkest feasts were born from a desire to understand the unknowable. And in the hush of the next chapter, we step away from the frosty hearths of the north and into the warm smoke of distant temples where the gods may or may not have had a taste for something more. Tonight, we drift into golden light and obsidian shadow, where maize rustles through ancient air and stone pyramids rise like frozen thunderclouds. We are stepping softly into the land of the Aztecs, a sun-washed, feather-festooned empire where the gods were demanding, the calendars were precise, and every now and then, somebody was turned into soup. But not without purpose. No, definitely not without purpose. The Aztecs didn't do things halfway. These were people who could cultivate chinampas, those floating gardens that bobbed on lakes like green rafts of plenty, and build cities so grand that Spanish invaders gawked in envy. Yet, nestled between astronomical genius and artful poetry, the Aztecs also held a deep belief that the gods had a favorite cookbook, with the occasional human entry. Now, before we drift too deeply into moral comparisons, it's worth remembering that to the Aztecs, what they were doing wasn't cruel. It was cosmic maintenance. Every cycle of life, sunshine, maize, seasons, population booms, was borrowed power from the gods. Those gods, bless their celestial egos, were ravenously fond of a little tribute. Blood was a breakfast beverage. Hearts were mid-morning snacks. But the most curious culinary tale of all lies with a deity named Totec. Ah, Totec, literally the flayed one, the spring god of rebirth and renewal. Oddfellow. Picture a golden god wearing a human skin like a ceremonial bathrobe. A bit odd, yes, but we're not judging. This fashion choice wasn't metaphorical. Priests would wear the freshly flayed skin of sacrificial victims for days, strolling about with the peeled outer layer draped like ancient haute couture, complete with eye holes and a distinct wet leather ambience. You see, Totec represented the shedding of old identity, like corn husks peeling back from golden kernels, or a snake leaving behind its used pajamas. With this symbol of renewal, life could return to soil, and the crops could come back once more. As is always the case in sleepy history, unusual rituals often spring from poetry. The death of winter reborn as spring. A fresh harvest born from sacrifice. Now, while you're lying there very comfortably, picture the Tlakaxipewalistli festival. Say that 5 times slowly, preferably by moonlight. This was a springtime ritual honoring Totec. It included ritual combat, in which warriors were tied to a large circular stone and fought off opponents with feathered weapons, something between a fight and a feathery pillow duel, terribly dramatic and oddly festive. The losers were sacrificed, and then, well, the flaying commenced. The resulting garments were worn by priests who paraded through the streets, symbolizing the fresh skin of the earth, reborn after fertilizer, and evidently flayed people. Now, let's address the bitey elephant in the temple. Was this cannibalism? Well, sort of. Some sources suggest that bits of the sacrificial victims were indeed consumed, but very specifically, ritually, and sparingly. We're not talking all-you-can-eat buffets here. More like a spiritual hors d'oeuvre. The heart, offered to the gods, was the main course, metaphysically speaking. But limbs might be divided among participating nobles, cooked with maize and chilies, and consumed in sacred meals. This wasn't lunch. It was theology with seasoning. And as strange as it sounds, It functioned like communion, a sacred act of spiritual connection through shared sustenance. It's important to remember that in Aztec cosmology, humans were created from godly sacrifice. The gods had bled for mankind. Eating part of the sacrifice wasn't barbaric, it was reciprocal. A chewy thank you note to the universe. Of course, when Spanish missionaries saw all this, their reaction was less poetic. Horrified chroniclers wrote breathless reports back to Europe. Hands were wrung, crosses clutched. But in time, anthropologists sifted through the drama and the dogma to find meaning in the mythos. And here, in this dreamy chapter of history, we find ourselves not at a gruesome dinner party, but somewhere gentler, somewhere where soil meets season, and rituals, however unsettling, seek harmony with harvest. So as you melt into your pillow like warm maize dough, remember that even amid obsidian knives and flayed robes, there existed a deep, yearning order, a belief in cycles, in exchange, in the sacred rhythms of give and take. Strange, yes, but somehow hauntingly coherent. And now, with Zyptotec shedding his symbolic skin beneath a yawning sky, let us tiptoe away from the Valley of Mexico. There's another land waiting next, where sacred hunger took on altogether smokier flavors. You are floating now gently, as if the warm winds of the Valley of Mexico were carrying you through the clouds. Below, copper sunbeams spill across turquoise lakes and stepped temples. Welcome to the city of Tenochtitlan, a marvel of geometry, theology, and, well, heart. Yes, quite literally. The Aztecs, an industrious and deeply religious people with a flair for agriculture, astronomy, and enormous feathered hats, also had something of a unique culinary relationship with people. Though the modern dinner guest may frown upon being part of the menu, ancient Nahor societies didn't necessarily see this as rude. It might have even been a compliment. We're talking about ritual sacrifice paired with ritual consumption. Not daily fare, of course. It wasn't as if every Tuesday was Tocopalips night. These were ceremonial dishes, meals made holy not by spice rubs, but by sacred symbolism. Hours of chanting and some light cardio involving pyramids. The Aztecs believed that the gods had once sacrificed themselves to create the world and its people. It was a celestial act of culinary generosity. So it stood to reason, like any good gift exchange, that humans must offer their own lives to keep the divine fire burning. Blood was divine compost, hearts were sacred fertilizer, and sometimes, after the flames of ceremony died down, the bodies didn't just disappear. They were honored, consumed by priests, elites, and possibly royal stomachs. Now, I know what you're imagining. A smoky campfire, maize tortillas, someone asking, white meat or thigh? But let's ease gently into this. The primary figure in these offerings was often the impersonator of a god, most famously Xipe-Totec or Huitzilopochtli. Individuals were selected, revered, groomed, and adorned until they almost became the gods themselves. They were treated with deep respect, pampered with fine clothing and showers of flowers before being ceremonially sacrificed. Their elevated status was meant to be an honor, a transition from mortal to divine snack. In some rituals, once the sacrifice had taken place atop one of those dramatically vertical temples, the body descended down the steps, possibly rather unceremoniously, where it would be received by priests and nobility. The thighs, perhaps the most tender part, were said to be boiled and prepared with maize. The heart, already offered to the gods, was notably not part of the after-party. Eating the flesh wasn't considered vulgar or gluttonous. It was sacred, a way to absorb the power and presence of the deity. Think communion, with a bit more protein. It's important to say the practice wasn't widespread pauper meals. This wasn't a dish you could pick up at the street market next to the avocados and hanging skull racks. Human flesh was reserved for remarkable occasions and prominent participants. Most Aztecs lived their lives exclusively fueled by beans, amaranth, and chili sauces sharp enough to make a god sweat. And for all this gory grandeur, the motives weren't simple cruelty. They were spiritual bookkeeping. The gods had sacrificed themselves to maintain the sun. In return, people sacrificed people to pay the cosmic rent. The logic was, in its way, heartbreakingly earnest. The Spanish conquistadors, upon arrival, were simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Somewhere between cataloguing gold ornaments and stealing local alphabets, they took vigorous notes on the rituals. Whether the reports were slightly embellished, much like your cousin's fishing stories, remains a point of scholarly pillow talk. But the themes of human sacrifice and occasional post-sacrifice noshing are well supported by both Spanish reports and the Aztecs' own codices. Now, before you worry that this practice dominated every moment of Aztec life, let's remember that this same civilization engineered floating gardens, developed one of the most accurate calendars of the era, and had a word for the vague longing you feel while watching hummingbirds dance above a volcano at twilight. Okay, I made that last one up, but it feels like they would have had a word for that, doesn't it? So here, under the drowsy obsidian sky, we see a people who feared the end of the sun, who believed the world needed nourishment as much as they did. Their sacrifices were, in a way, offerings of hope. And perhaps that's the soft heart within the hardtail. Not gruesome appetites, but a passionate devotion to harmony with the cosmos, even if the recipe was occasionally unconventional. Now drift slowly beyond the throne of Tenochtitlan. In the distance, across time and taste, another fire flickers, its smoke rising from the slopes of the Andes. But what did the Inca bring to their god's table? Let's whisper along and find out. Let's drift now to the Valley of Mexico, where obsidian sparkles under moonlight and temple steps are worn smooth from centuries of sacred footsteps. The air here carries a faint scent of maize, incense, and a mystery too old to question. Welcome to the world of the Aztecs, a civilization so layered with symbols, cycles, and ceremony. They made quantum physics look like kindergarten. But tonight, we're interested in what they were serving, specifically the ritual meals that bordered on the divine and the digestible. Yes, dear dreamer, tonight we gently nibble on the enigma of Aztec ritual cannibalism. Or was it ritual communion? Or maybe something stranger, more theatrical, symbolic, and spiced? Now, contrary to the popular horror stories spoon-fed by conquistador chronicles, the Aztecs didn't exactly have an all-you-can-eat buffet of conquered foes. Their rituals were specific, ceremonial, and deeply spiritual. But still, eyebrows were raised, and perhaps stomachs turned, when the Spanish chroniclers came across what looked suspiciously like sacred barbecues. Let's set the scene. A human sacrifice is made atop the Grand Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. The heart is lifted to the sky, the blood offered to Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war. The body is lowered ceremonially, and sometimes, just sometimes, the limbs are taken to elite feasts. But here's where it gets oddly cozy. Before you assume this was just a culinary impulse gone gory, understand that these acts were packed tight with cosmological symbolism. For the Aztecs, to consume a piece of a ritually sacrificed individual was not an act of appetite, but of reverence. The one consumed had become divine, a living god in human form. So in essence, this was less Hannibal Lecter, more Holy Communion. with slightly more chili powder. In fact, food and deity often blurred in their worldview. So Ali, a dough made of amaranth seeds and honey, was molded into the shapes of gods. These edible idols were ritually killed and eaten in ceremonies not unlike our modern communion wafers, except, with a bit more crunch and sesame. This edible theology had a delicious duality. It was both profoundly symbolic and, frankly, quite practical. In an ecosystem with few large mammals, protein was scarce. So while nobles dined ceremonially on select parts of sacrificed captives, most of the population transformed symbolic gods into honey cakes and grain effigies. A spiritual snack, if you will. And not everyone agreed on what was truly divine on the dinner plate. Take the feast of Tlacaxipehualistli. Try saying that with a marshmallow in your mouth, where flayed skins were worn by impersonators of the god Zipe Totec. These skinned priestly cosplayers would parade about the city, cloaked in human hide, until the flesh fell off naturally, or was gently persuaded. But again, it wasn't horror. It was harvest, renewal. The skin of sacrifice was the soil from which the grain of life might sprout anew. A little dark, but poetic. It's easy, in our soft beds and cotton pajamas, to judge the world atop magnesium memory foam. But imagine a world ruled by sun gods and droughts, where the next harvest may never come, and pleasing the gods was a daily matter of survival. The Aztecs weren't cruel, they were cosmically cautious. And yet, despite their seriousness, there was a certain theatrical flair to it all. Elaborate pageants, floral cloaks, hummingbird feathers and songs echoing through flower-scented plazas. The blend of blood and beauty, myth and maze. A people who danced with death and dined with divinity. So, was it cannibalism? Yes, but not quite. It was spirituality you could chew. Prayers served on plantain leaves. Now, as the moon rises a little higher above the Chinampas, the floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, and the wind carries the scent of maize and marigold, we'll gently close the curtain on this chapter of culinary cosmology. There's more to explore ahead, where divine feasts take an unexpected form. Let's drift onward, where food and faith embrace once more in lands far, far from the Aztec sun. Let's float now, like a canoe gliding over the rippling surface of Lake Texcoco, into the lush heart of Central America, where the air smells of maize and marigolds, and the sun enjoys watching humans build complicated temples beneath it. Welcome to the Aztec Empire, where the gods were hungry, the priests were busy, and ceremony days required a different kind of menu planning. Now, you may know the Aztecs as gifted architects, fierce warriors, and lovers of calendars so precise they made Swiss watchmakers feel mildly inadequate. But tonight, we nudge open the curtain to an often whispered curiosity. Their elaborate, sacred practice of ritual sacrifice, and the faint hint of holy cannibalism that came with it. Yes, cannibalism, but make it celestial. You see, for the Aztecs, this wasn't grim or gory, not in the way you'd expect. It was deeply symbolic, woven into mythologies older than oak trees, aimed at thanking their gods and keeping the universal gears turning. And if offerings sometimes included a nibble from the divine buffet, well, it was all part of honoring the cycle of life, death, and leftovers. Let's introduce the star of tonight's twilight tale, Huitzilopochtli, the mighty Aztec god of the sun and war. He had a magnificent name that sounds like sneezing politely at a museum, and he was perpetually engaged in an epic battle across the sky. Every sunrise was him waking up, every sunset a sign he was getting tuckered out. And how did the Aztecs ensure he'd rise again? Why? With energy-packed sacrifices, of course. Think of it as divine protein bars for solar deity performance. During the annual Panquetzalistli festival, dedicated entirely to Huitzilopochtli, the Aztecs prepared a rather special figure, an effigy of the god himself. But here's the dreamy twist. It was made not of stone or gold, but of amaranth dough mixed with honey and a touch of human blood. Adorable in a surprisingly reverent kind of way. This statue, among other ritual acts, would sometimes be broken apart and distributed to the people. They ate it ceremonially, believing they were ingesting the essence of the god, like a Holy Communion, but with more maize and fewer pews. In this perfectly edible effigy, we glimpse a central paradox of ancient rituals, the act of consuming to connect, of honoring a being by, well, literally taking them in. The boundaries between God and follower softened during these sacred snacks, and while other more graphic offerings took place, ones that did involve the practical anatomy of war captives, most forms of reported cannibalism in the Aztec world were deeply sacred, structured, and rarer than half-price obsidian. Now, to paint the full dreamscape, imagine the great Templo Mayor rising beneath a twilight sky, crowned in smoke and song. The drums thump like a giant's heartbeat. Flower petals drift in the air, and around you, people chant as maize dough in the shape of deities is passed from palm to palm. Behind the ritual choreography lies a cosmic belief that the gods gave of themselves first, bleeding to create the world, and so humans gave back in kind. A spiritual reciprocity, the universe's rudest potluck, when no one dared show up empty-handed. It might make modern sleepers squirm, but the Aztecs saw death, sacrifice, and sacred consumption as not only acts of honor, but ones of hope. The rituals were restorative, ensuring the sun would rise and rain would come, and that life would dance on, powdered in cornflour and painted in sky blue. And as the firelight flickers gently off obsidian blades and deities carved in jade, we retreat slowly from this dusky celebration. Kneel now in your mind's temple courtyard. Breathe the thick air of sage and smoke. Hear the voices, not in fear, but in reverence, echoing off the cooling stone. No nightmares here, dear dreamer. Just the ancient notion that sometimes, to touch the divine, you had to feast like one. And now, as the stars smile down over Tenochtitlan, our dream oar turns east, where another civilization once watched its gods glitter over golden beaches. Drift with me now, softly as mist over old stone temples, to an empire of golden sun gods, feathered serpents, and marketplaces bursting with tomatoes, chocolate, and occasional morsels of not-so-voluntary protein. Welcome to the Aztec Empire, where the pyramids were grand, the calendars precise, and dinner sometimes looked back at you. In the bustling heart of Tenochtitlan, the ancient capital that glistened atop lake waters like a mirage in a dream, the Aztecs lived with an intensity that would make your local yoga teacher ask them to tone things down. Rich in cosmos, calculation, and cuisine, they knew the importance of honoring their gods, and their interpretation of honoring veered enthusiastically into the carnivorous. Now, before we wander too far into menu details, let's consider the bigger picture. The Aztecs didn't just nibble their neighbors on a whim. Oh no, this wasn't chaos. This was theology, ecology, and a dash of imperial performance art. At the core of their belief system was the sun god Huitzilopochtli. A being so energetic, he needed regular refreshment in the form of human hearts, not just a symbolic offering, but a rather hands-on approach to cosmic maintenance. The world, in their view, was perpetually on the edge of annihilation, only held together with generous donations of blood and occasionally biceps. Large-scale rituals, sometimes involving thousands of captives taken in battle, were conducted at towering temples. The most famous of these was the Templo Mayor, where priests conducted ceremonies dressed in everything from jaguar pelts to flayed human skins. A couture line I do not recommend reviving. But the curious detail, softly tucked into the folds of time and codices, is what happened after the sacrifice. You see, those bodies didn't always just vanish into the ether. Some scholars and ancient Spanish chroniclers suggest that certain parts were cooked, seasoned, and served to select elites. A diplomatic dinner with slightly more screaming than usual. The arms and thighs, reportedly, were the choice cuts. They'd be stewed with maize, chili, and herbs in a dish known not so cryptically as tlacatlaoli, or man maize. A recipe with a distinctly final ingredient. But before we judge too harshly from our modern armchairs, draped in cozy blankets and snack wrappers, let's pause. This was not about hunger or horror. The Aztec Empire was agriculturally rich. They farmed on floating gardens, chinampas, like poetic green rafts drifting in watery grid lines. They weren't desperate for meat. They were devoted to a cosmology where consuming one's enemy preserved power and balanced cosmic debt. To them, eating a bit of your fallen foe was not a culinary crime. It was a sacred synergy. It's as if the dinner plate became a passport for the spirit, guiding it safely onward with a little poblano heat. And the leftovers? Oh yes, even ritual meat may require Tupperware. Skulls of the sacrificed were lovingly cleaned and added to the tzompantli, gigantic skull racks displayed near temples. A gruesome version of holiday beads, perhaps, though notably less festive. Interestingly, it wasn't all about warriors and warfare. Some sacrifices were volunteers. Well, sort of. A particular young man, chosen each year to represent the god Tezcatlipoca, was treated like a celebrity for months. He wore feathers, played flutes, received adoration from the public. Then, on the day of his tribute, he was serenaded up the temple steps, given a final flower, and gently escorted into reincarnated retirement via ceremonial knife. There's something heartbreakingly theatrical about it, as though life itself were a pageant, and the finale always involved at least one dramatic gesture, and, ideally, a side of beans. Of course, when the Spanish arrived, capes flapping, crosses shining, they had a few opinions about all this. Many accounts of Aztec cannibalism come from these conquistadors, and they may have exaggerated a detail or 10. Whether the ritual meals were widespread or reserved for the divine few remains unclear, blurred by conquest, translation, and the awkward silence that follows, say, being offered a stew you suspect once had a hobby. Still, somewhere between horror story and Holy Supper lies a culture in pursuit of balance between dark and light, life and death, heaven and hearth. So close your eyes now. Imagine the flickering torchlight on temple walls, the aroma of maize drifting through twilight air. The world is heavier here, but not unkind. And as stardust settles softly over the Valley of Mexico, our journey carries us gently forward towards ceremonial cups, sacred vines, and the spirited beginnings of blood and wine. Let us drift now, not forward or backward exactly, but sideways into the dazzling, incense-heavy halls of divine feasts and delusional gods, where a symphony of storytelling, sacred symbolism, and suspiciously metaphorical menus fed the folklores of millennia. Yes, we've floated into myth, dreamy, glittering myth, where wine flows without limit, mortals become morsels, and the gods never pick up the tab. Our sleep-bound tale tonight takes a little detour through something curiously lacking in solid evidence, but strangely overfed in imagination: the ritualistic meals of divine appeasement. That is, what people thought the gods wanted for dinner, and how that sometimes, inconveniently, for some, ended up being a person. Let's set the table in ancient Greece first, shall we? Now, the Greeks were not in the habit of eating each other on a regular basis. They were far more partial to grilled goat and philosophical banter. But their mythology? Oh, it had an appetite. One of the juiciest stories, possibly the stuffiest dish in all of Hellenic lore, was about Tantalus, the original party planner from the underworld. Tantalus, in a moment of incomprehensible hubris, or perhaps just a really bad dinner idea, decided to impress the Olympian gods by cooking and serving them his own son, Pelops. Why did he do it? The motives are unclear. Perhaps he wanted to test their omniscience, or perhaps he was an early practitioner of the asset-light parenting model. Either way, it didn't go well. The gods, allegedly omnipotent and slightly fussy eaters, immediately noticed something was off with the stew, all except poor Demeter, who, preoccupied with mourning her abducted daughter, took a distracted bite of shoulder. A little understandable, perhaps. We've all eaten something regretful when sad. Needless to say, the gods were horrified. They reassembled Pelops, son's shoulder. Hephaestus kindly fashioned him a prosthetic one of ivory, which gave him a dash of elegance at toga parties, and cast Tantalus into eternal punishment, which, for the record, involved standing in water he could never drink, beneath fruit he could never reach. Food-related irony was a popular theme among immortals, but there is something strangely touching to these stories. Within the grisly banquet lies a cautionary tale about divinity, mortality, and knowing your proper place at the table, which, as it turns out, is rarely under the roast. Now, let's slide, like a well-oiled olive, over to Mesoamerica. Here, the gods had a distinctly protein-rich diet, at least according to the myths surrounding them. The Aztecs, for instance, believed the sun god Huitzilopochtli required regular nourishment in the form of human hearts to keep his solar engine running. But contrary to popular belief and sensationalist pulp novels, this wasn't drawn from pure barbarism. It was cosmology. The Aztecs genuinely thought the universe itself depended on a sacred exchange, a divine economy, if you will. The sun gave light, the crops grew, the people lived. In return, a little crimson down payment from the chest of a willing or less than willing participant. Divine reciprocity. Some civilizations offer incense, others offer interns. But again, it's vital to understand that many so-called cannibalistic rituals weren't routine meals. They were highly stylized offerings, often metaphoric, and sometimes entirely symbolic. The act of consuming a part of the divine, or that which had been made divine, was seen as a way to connect with gods, not as Friday night dinner plans. Elsewhere, in the cool stone temples of the Inca Empire, there's evidence that children were ritualistically sacrificed and possibly consumed, but likely only during times of great duress, such as crop failure or celestial panic, and even then, not for food, but for favor. Stranger still, the sacrificial children, known as capacocha, were selected from noble families, honored, pampered, and made to believe they were ascending to a godlike status. Martyrdom with a headdress. One wouldn't call it comforting exactly, but it was more evening gown than butcher's apron. The truth is, Many of these shadowy rituals walked the knife's edge between story and ceremony, between honoring the gods and explaining the unexplainable. A failed harvest, a tyrant's whim, an eclipse that overstayed its welcome. As you nestle deeper into your blanket and let this curious history breathe foggily in your mind, remember this: even in tales of ritual consumption, there's often more metaphor than meat. Sweet dreams, dear traveller of time, as we dim the torches and leave behind the echo of myth-fed feasts. For where we go next, the fire has almost gone out, and only hush and smoke remain. Now let's float gently down to the Valley of Mexico, where the air was thinner, the volcanoes were pointier, and the gods were terribly hungry. It was the height of the Aztec Empire, the 15th century, give or take a feathered headdress, and Tenochtitlan gleamed like a stone mirage in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Think Venice, but with more jaguars and fewer gondolas. The Aztecs were impressive architects, precise astronomers, and, importantly for tonight's tale, very diligent sacrificial schedulers. Their calendar wasn't just about when to plant maize or host a featherball tournament. It was also about when to feed the divine. You see, the Aztecs believed the sun god, Huitzilopochtli, whose name is best attempted only after a warm cup of bedtime tea, needed something extra to rise each morning. Something vibrant, vital, something pumping with life force. And oh yes, that something was human blood. Now for the Aztecs, sacrifice wasn't grim. Not exactly. It was sacred. Beautiful even, like giving the ultimate gift. A ticket straight to divine favor, or at least not divine neglect, which can result in all manner of inconvenient droughts and eclipses. Our sleepy focus this evening, though, isn't on the mechanics of climbing pyramids with ominous drums beating behind you, but rather on what sometimes happened after the noble heart had been offered skyward, because in a number of ceremonies, and don't worry, I'll whisper the details, the body was not always discarded. In fact, it could end up, shall we say, repurposed. Yes, in some instances, the remains of sacrificial victims, particularly captured warriors from rival city-states, were cooked and ritually consumed. Not by just anyone. This wasn't a public buffet scenario, but often by the priests and elite nobles. There was a dish, a thick and fragrant stew called tlacatlaoli, which, if you're brave enough to try pronouncing before dozing off, means something like man stew. It might contain maize, chilies, and fine herbs, and on occasion, human meat. In this culinary context, the body was not seen as meat in the everyday sense, but as sacred matter, infused with divinity. The meal, then, was not indulgent or driven by hunger, but ritualistic, a holy consumption reserved for carefully chosen ceremonies, often intended to absorb the power, courage, or spiritual potency of the sacrificed. It may sound horrifying now, and, well, yes, there's no dressing that up in basil leaves, but within their belief system, everything mattered symbolically. The body fed the earth, the sun, and the spirit. Some scholars argue this practice mirrored myths of gods feeding gods in primordial times, a cycle of cosmic nourishment. To them, it wasn't cannibalism as we understand it. That word hadn't even strolled in from Europe yet. No, this wasn't zombies at a toga party. This was religious performance, ethical and divine, despite its rather chewy implications. And here's a cozy footnote for your pillow tonight. Not every report we have came from Aztecs themselves. Much of what we know comes from the pens and imaginations of Spanish conquistadors and clerics, who might have scribbled in a few dramatic shivers for good measure. After all, Nothing justifies conquest like painting your opponents with wide brushes of savagery and a side of spicy stew, right? It's possible, even probable, that ritual cannibalism was rare or symbolic more than common or culinary. But somewhere, sometime, someone sipped some soup, and that odd little detail made the leap from temple step to historical record. So as you rest here tonight, drifting under that soft lake fog where Tenochtitlan once shimmered, picture the sacred fires crackling, obsidian blades gleaming in the morning sun, and the solemn pact the Aztecs believed they were upholding, helping the world survive, one spoonful at a time. Tomorrow's whisper will carry us farther eastward, where gods wore golden masks and mountain mummies knew many secrets. Let us drift, ever so gently now, to the lush green folds of the Valley of Mexico. The year is somewhere between legend and conquest, and the air is thick with aromas, fresh corn tortillas, wood smoke, and just a hint of ceremonial dread. Welcome, dear dreamer, to an Aztec festival. Now, the Aztecs were a complex people. Brilliant urban planners, fierce warriors, meticulous astronomers, and yes, occasional participants in what we might gently call divinely inspired nibbling. But before your pillow tenses in alarm, remember, this was less horror story and more holy sacrament. For the Aztecs, consuming tiny morsels of a sacrificed body wasn't a feast of flesh, but a way to bring the gods and their power into one's very soul. Take, for example, the festival of Tlacaxipehualistli. Rolls delightfully off the tongue, doesn't it? And if you murmur it just right, it sounds like someone trying to sneeze into a feathered mask. This particular spring festival, held to honor the god Xipe-Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, featured several exciting elements. A bit of sacred costume design involving fresh human skins, a festive parade of voluntarily captured warriors, and occasionally post-sacrifice rituals that included ritual cannibalism. But not how you think. There was method, there was meaning, there were rules. The sacrificed, typically captives of war, seen as sacred emissaries to the gods, were honored in death. Their bodies were carefully prepared. Certain portions, usually limbs, might be shared among priests and nobles, cooked in stews and consumed not with barbarity, but with solemn reverence. It wasn't lunch, it was liturgy. Now, let's not pretend every Aztec was sitting down with bone china and candlelight. This was more symbolic than sumptuous. In fact, archaeologist Eduardo Matos Moctezuma refers to these practices as ritual endocannibalism, eating within the societal group, intended to spiritually unite the community with divine essence. Quite the holy hors d'oeuvre, really. And lest you imagine casual buffet lines, know this. Much of Aztec ritual cuisine was deeply intertwined with the maize, chilies, and the sacred cacao. Yes, the very early chocolate we now sip on rainy evenings started as a bitter elixir in Aztec temples, often spiced with blood, chili, and sometimes just a whisper of ground bone. Can you picture it? The glint of obsidian blades under the temple sun, drummers pounding rhythms that echoed like heartbeats, the drape of jaguar skins, the whispers of incense smoke, and then, at the height of ritual, an offering made physical not only upon the altar, but within the belly of believers. Now, while you lie there cushioned in softness and safely centuries away from such toothsome theology, consider this curious question. Was this a solemn form of religious communion, or a culturally approved act of sacred terror? The truth, like a feathered serpent, slithers between both. Spanish conquistadors, those chroniclers of blood and brimstone, often exaggerated these rites, fanning exaggerated tales of knightly gore to justify their conquest. And yet, beneath their trembling quills, kernels of truth remain. But should we shudder, or should we understand? The Aztecs didn't consume the flesh of foes for hunger or pleasure. No, they believed they were maintaining cosmic balance, feeding the gods so the sun would rise, the rains would fall, and the maize would grow. A sacrificial souffle stirred with meaning. Imagine how truly different a worldview must be to eat someone not out of hostility, but love. It must be said, too, that not all Aztecs partook in these rituals. Much like your modern cousin Earl who refuses to try sushi, some citizens likely opted for the maize-only menu. Not every stomach is forged in divine fire. Perhaps you're wondering now, as torches flicker low and sleep pulls you toward dreams shaped like feathered pyramids. What happened to these practices? Well, eventually, as empires fell and customs crumbled beneath the boot heels of hungry colonizers, the gods found new altars, and the stew pots were replaced by sermons. Yet somewhere beneath the stone skyline of ancient Tenochtitlan, you can still feel that old heartbeat thrumming in the dust. Now settle in, little historian. Nestle among your blankets like a cacao bean in a cozy pod. For in the candlelit corridors of time, we're about to meet a people whose appetites were not just spiritual, but sweet. But more on that, after a dreamy sigh. Ah, Rome, the eternal city, cradle of civilization and, at least for a brief, eyebrow-raising moment in history, a rumored site of sacrificial snacking in the old-time religion scene. Now, to be perfectly fair to the toga-wearing masses, most Romans very much disliked the idea of human flesh on the menu. It severely violated their well-appointed sense of order, decency, and dinner etiquette. After all, you can hardly manage a proper 9-course cena if your appetizers are actively screaming. But that doesn't mean Rome wasn't watching. The Roman Empire, with its vast tentacles stretching from desert outposts in Syria to fog-swathed isles of Britannia, had a habit of collecting whispers. And one particular whisper, soft as papyrus and twice as fragile, snuck its way across forums and scrolls. Were foreign cults dining in questionable ways? Our story tonight floats toward a rather peculiar trial in the 2nd century BCE. Picture this. Rome is expanding like an overfed octopus. It's 186 BCE, mid-republic, mid-drama, and mid-choosing whether to adopt or squash every new belief system that comes trotting in across the Appian Way. At the center of this theatrical scandal was the Bacchanalia, a secretive rite involving wine, dancing, and suspiciously flexible personal boundaries. The Senate was, let's say, extremely not into it, and according to Livy, Rome's unofficial gossipy historian-in-residence, these Bacchic gatherings were accused of all sorts of depravity, including, wait for it, ritual murder and cannibalism. That's right. Human sacrifice, murder cover-ups, sausage-based evidence tampering, the works. It sounds like an episode of true crime ancient edition. And whether or not it was true, Livy had a flair for dramatic flourish and may have invented half the court transcript. It was enough to lead to a massive crackdown. Thousands were arrested, some were executed. The rest probably just learned to keep quiet around senators. But was cannibalism really happening under Bacchus's influence? The evidence is, shall we say, historically nappable. That is to say, none of it holds much weight under a well-lit analysis. The accusations of ritually consuming human flesh were likely less about truth and more about revulsion. Rome's traditional method of delegitimizing foreign cults by making them sound like a Tuesday night horror show. It's a tale as old as empires. He who controls the narrative decides whether you're a philosopher or someone who snacks on neighbors by torchlight. And yet, Rome had its contradictions. While publicly condemning cannibalism, Romans were known to pragmatically dissect the bodies of dead gladiators and criminals, not for nutrition, but for their perceived magical properties. Yes, really. Some upper-class folks believed that drinking the blood of a fallen gladiator could cure epilepsy, though frankly, they never seemed to have asked the gladiator's opinion on the matter. Others powdered bones into medicinal potions in an early attempt at mixing pharmacy with, well, necromancy. Still, even these things were done with a certain detached dignity. No feasting, no chewing, just a medically distant sip. As always, context was everything. Of course, there were times Rome encountered cultures where ritual cannibalism was ceremonially practiced for complex religious reasons. The Roman response? Equal parts horror, fascination, and mighty judgment. Not unlike how one might regard a cheese that's both suspiciously soft and moving slightly. But what's truly fascinating, and a little sleepily funny, is how cannibalism sometimes became shorthand for "these people are too different." Rome didn't invent the tactic, but by Jupiter's beard, they perfected it. If a group believed in strange gods, wore stranger clothes, and didn't respect Roman table manners, well, they must be stirring something unspeakable in their cauldrons. And so, cannibalism remained both myth and method, an accusation used to draw lines around Rome's ever-expanding sense of self versus other. Though Rome eventually fell under the weight of its ambition and excess, its anxieties about rituals, bodies, and keeping the dinner courses strictly non-human echo in quiet little corners of history. So now, as we drift gently across the faded mosaic floors of time, let's turn our dreamy gaze toward the tribal north, where ancient Germanic and Celtic peoples had feasts of their own, some noble, some wild, and some, maybe, just maybe, cooked up with a sprinkle of myth and mystery. Let's journey next to the twilight rituals of old Europe, where warriors dined with the gods, or possibly on them. Shh. We'll get there soon. Let sleep hug your thoughts like a Roman cloak at dusk. Picture the sun setting lilac and gold over the Nile. Palm fronds whisper like hushed gossip. Crocodiles nap with suspicious stillness. And in the air hangs a gentle sweetness, honey, incense, and something perhaps more metaphorical. Because tonight, dear dreamer, we are invited to an ancient Egyptian feast. Not just any light supper under starlight, mind you. This is a meal for the departed. Oh yes, the Egyptians truly knew how to throw a going-away party. You see, in the mist-soft halls of ancient Theban tombs, and across the sandy grounds of Saqqara, the Old Kingdom's elite were given more than just a painted farewell. They were sent off with meat pies, fruit, jars of beer, and, yes, perhaps a symbolic nibble of eternity itself. For in the hazy border between ritual and reality, the living communion with the dead came with its own menu. Let us gently peek into the rite known as the opening of the mouth. Now, despite how dramatic that sounds, it was less a dentist appointment and more a priestly performance art intended to restore a deceased person's senses in the afterlife, so that the dearly departed could enjoy their meals, to smell the lotus, hear the harp music, and crucially, swallow the roast duck offered on a silver dish. Now, it's time we talk about the feasting itself. Don't worry. The actual consumption of human flesh, that sticky main course of our broader exploration, was notably absent in Egyptian traditions. They were, on the whole, impressively restrained in the realm of ritual gnawing. However, that's not to say their feasts weren't soaked in symbolism. Quite the opposite. The funerary banquet was attended by mourners, priests, and sometimes professional wailers. Yes, hired mourners who could sob and snot on command, bringing appropriate levels of drama, all gathered to honor the ka, or life force, of the deceased. And what's the best way to feed a wandering ka? Why, by indulging in roast goose, round loaves, and dates so sweet they'd almost forgive the whole dying part. But here's where things get tastefully bizarre. Some scholars believe, and they say this very quietly, usually while adjusting their glasses, that in a few particularly ancient practices, symbolic cannibalism may have been on the menu, served brain first. In the pyramid texts found on the insides of Old Kingdom royal tombs, we read enchanted poetry suggesting that the king, upon death, becomes a star-devouring deity, devouring the gods themselves in an act of celestial dominance. One particularly vivid incantation from Tomb Tea of Unas, the first known Egyptian king to be mummified, rather poetically declares that he consumes the hearts of gods and gains wisdom, eats their entrails and inherits power, and drinks their blood to grow ancient and immortal. All this delivered in the sort of lyrical cadences that make it sound almost like a lullaby. If lullabies were written by someone with a rather bold attitude toward divine digestion. Was this literal? Unlikely. Despite being surrounded by lavish temples and acutely sharp embalming tools, the Egyptians were symbolic to their very bones. The words weren't instructions, but spells. Poetry designed less for chewing and more for changing one's state of being. Unas was not eating actual gods, at least not as far as we know, but instead becoming something godlike through ritual narration, a divine snack with a literary twist. Still, on the terrestrial plane, the offering table was very real. Platters of ox meat, baskets of figs, alabaster jars of wine, and little wax or clay replicas of servants and bakers were placed with loving care, just in case the gods got picky and the real ones called in sick. And those replicas, entire armies of them, known as shabtis, lined tomb chambers like a surprisingly helpful minibar staff. They were there not to serve dinner, of course, but to do chores in the afterlife on the owner's behalf. So whenever eternal housework came knocking, these little statues would leap into unanimated action. Quite comforting if you're the reclining royalty type. So, did the Egyptians practice ritual cannibalism? No, not really. Their culinary rituals were more honeyed than horrific, more poetic than predatory. Even their most unsettling funerary verses were scribed with golden ink and recited like bedtime psalms. Everything meant something larger, gentler, transforming loss into language, grief into gumbo, symbolically of course. And with that feather-light step into Egypt's flavorful afterlife, let us drift gently toward an even older dining table, where the gods, ancestors, and an unexpected jungle or two await just beyond the veil of sleep. Let us drift, ever so slowly, toward the misty marshlands of Neolithic Europe, where lakes hummed with frogs and secrets, and where, oddly enough, people may have been drinking from cups made of human skulls. Yes, tonight, we tenderly cradle the curious case of the bone cups of Shalin. Now, don't worry, no one's handing out hot cocoa in a human head. Or at least, not anymore. Our story unfolds along the soft edges of what is now eastern France, near the placid waters of Lake Chalin. Thousands of years ago, in the early 3rd millennium BCE, small communities lived along stilted homes built above the lake. These were the lake dwellers, resourceful, likely a bit damp, and surprisingly organized for folks who still loved a good stone axe. And among their many treasures, pottery, wooden paddles, and the occasional slightly shocked archaeologist, archaeological digs revealed an item that stirred both curiosity and a subtle shudder: cups, bowls, and other useful shapes fashioned from the top portions of human skulls. What on earth for? Now, before we accuse them of hosting something out of a low-budget horror film, let's adjust our modern lenses. The Shallan folk weren't mass-producing skullware for their Etsy shops. These crania cups show signs of delicate processing. The edges are neatly worked, smoothed and shaped, but not in a factory-like way. These were one-offs, ritual objects, possibly sacred, possibly passed down like your grandmother's ladle. Except this one used to belong to Uncle Bob in more ways than one. There's little evidence to suggest outright cannibalism in these lakeside communities, unlike other sites around the world, where butchered bones revealed enthusiastic nibbling. The remains at Shallan do not wear the telltale marks of chewing or boiling, which suggests, perhaps delightfully, that these skull cups were not born out of hunger, but reverence. Some anthropologists argue that turning a loved one's skull into a ritual drinking vessel might have been an act of memorialization, a physical way to honor ancestors, to keep them close at ceremonies, or to whisper messages through sips of fermented lake beer. It's like a photo on the mantle, only with higher fluid capacity. And so we can picture it. Low evening sun casting amber over the water, birds calling lazily through reeds, and a community gathering for a feast of fruits, grains, and maybe a smoked fish or two. At the center, someone lifts a cup, worn smooth by years of use, and tilts it toward the dusk, taking communion with the past. It's possible these people believed that drinking from a skull carried not just memory, but power. The wisdom of the old poured into the mouths of the living through each ceremonial sip. A toasting, a tethering, a sleepy, sacred ritual. And curiously enough, the phenomenon isn't isolated. Across time and space, from the Scythians of the Eurasian steppes to Tibetan monks in high mountain monasteries, various cultures have, at one point or another, seen head-shaped drinking vessels as spiritually potent. A skull, after all, once held thoughts, memories, and mysteriously dreams. Reusing such an object could be, paradoxically, the most respectful thing one could do, turning death into communion, loss into connection. Now, of course, all mentions of bone cups tend to wrinkle modern noses. We've become awfully hygienic, perhaps too hygienic, to entertain the wisdom of ceremonial dishware made from relatives. But that doesn't mean we can't admire the poetry of it. In a world without photo albums or USBs full of vacation selfies, one's lasting presence might be lovingly polished into a vessel, offered to the firelight and passed from hand to solemn hand. So as you nestle into your pillow tonight, picture the calm banks of Lake Shallan, the soft lapping of water, the low hum of a reed flute, and the ghost of a toast rising gently into the twilight. What secrets swirled in those ancient cups, and what precisely were they toasting to? Perhaps our next destination will offer a clue as we wander into darker cellars and ceremonial echoes beneath the stone temples of forgotten empires. Let us float now to the mist-wrapped highlands of Papua New Guinea, where the wind hums softly through the trees, and the fog hangs like an old shawl forgotten by the morning. This is the realm of the Four People, a community that, not so very long ago in the cozy corners of the 20th century, partook in a ritual that was far more intimate than anything you'll find in a travel brochure. For the Four, life and death weren't opposites. They were roommates who shared the same hammock, and when someone passed on from this world, the proper way to say goodbye wasn't with lament and lilies, but with something far more digestive. You see, the four practiced what's been termed mortuary cannibalism, a rather scholarly way of saying they ate their dead, but not out of malice or madness. No, this was love, in its most macabre and heartwarming form. When a loved one died, their body wasn't discarded. It was received, not to be buried in the earth, but to be taken into the living bodies of their family. A grandmother might become soup, a respected uncle, a roast. The bones were cracked, the marrow sipped quietly under the dim yellow firelight. And the idea behind all this, that you don't just say goodbye to the ones you cherish, you carry them with you. A very literal interpretation of keeping them close. Now, if your eyebrows just try to climb off your forehead, fear not. This was no barbaric banquet. The four believed the soul had multiple parts. One part went on to the spirit world, another hung around the body, and another, well, that one passed into the bodies of the relatives who consumed the deceased, ensuring that something truly meaningful of the person remained within the family. You could argue it was a kind of ancestral vitamin, and it was the women, almost always the women, who carried out the preparation and the consumption of these dearly departed stews. Young children participated too, often girls, learning not just the recipes but the reverence. This was an act of deep respect, of cosmic continuity. A grandmother's hands made the food, and in time, she became the food. It was all profoundly circular. Now, the trouble with such touching traditions is that biology doesn't always share our sentimentality. The Fora began to experience something strange, a terrible trembling sickness they called kuru, meaning to shiver. It made one shake, stumble, giggle at inappropriate times, and eventually lose all control of muscles and faculties, slipping into a quiet, tragic death. Laughter that ended in silence. For a long time, no one outside the region could explain this mysterious illness. It eluded understanding, mocked medicine, and meandered through the community like a sleepy curse. That is, until scientists turned their sleepy eyes sharper and uncovered the culprit. Prions. Not lions, no. Prions. Mischievous, misfolded proteins that sneak into your nervous system and throw a molecular disco party without your permission. Kuru turned out to be a prion disease, spread by the consumption of infected human brains. Unluckily, often the most sacred and delicious portion in the ritual. The practice of ritual cannibalism had essentially invited a stealthy protein saboteur to tea. And not only did it not leave, it smashed every cup on the way out. Once, scientists, in their white coats of curiosity, explained all this to the world, and once the foray finally began to believe it, the practice waned. A sacred rite dimmed like a nightlight, turned off gently at midnight, and the Kuru epidemic too began to fade, leaving behind more questions than answers and more dreams than diagnoses. But listen closely. When we begin to judge the traditions of others in the fluorescent light of modernity, it's wise to remember that all of human culture is a long, lumpy quilt stitched together from things we no longer fully understand. The four weren't monsters, they were mourners. Their table wasn't one of horror, but of heritage. Not everything lovingly shared must pass through words. Some things pass through marrow. So, tucked now beneath the strange and wondrous canopy of human behavior, let us close our eyes and consider, where does love go when the body's gone? For the four, the answer was simple. It went home again, into the vessel of family, through soup and kinship. As we drift deeper into this sleepy trail of remembered rituals, our next story will tiptoe toward another ancient culture, where meals for the gods came with their own peculiar seasoning, salt, smoke, and perhaps just a hint of something more divine. Let us float now, beyond deserts and coasts, past tea-slicked hills and copper dusk skies, into the subcontinent of ancient India, a land where banyan trees knew the gossip of the gods and empires rose like quiet chants ascending from temple bells. Here, nestled in the folds of Vedic ritual and philosophical inquiry, we find whispers, fleeting, fragrant, elusive, of sacred consumption, of meals peppered with metaphysical hunger, and sometimes the unsettling suggestion of symbolic cannibalism. But don't worry, dear dreamer. The altars are cold now, and the sages long asleep. No one shall be consumed tonight except perhaps a late-night samosa, or some warm milk with cardamom. Now, the Vedic corpus, think of it as poetic scripture meets cosmic instruction manual, has quite a bit to say about what, when, and why to burn, sacrifice, chant, and eat. The Agnihotra, for instance, was a daily fire offering, conducted with the sort of reverent regularity that would make any modern commuter proud. These rites were more about restoring cosmic order than disturbing your digestion. However, within the more esoteric corners of Vedic ritual, particularly in texts like the Brahmanas and the Shatapatha Brahmana, there is something curious. A tale here, a metaphor there, all gently spooning out the idea that consuming human flesh, or at least pretending to, may have symbolized a kind of ultimate union with divinity. Take, for example, the eerie but calmly intoned tale of Purusha, the cosmic man, whose body was dismembered by the gods to create the universe. His mouth gave us Brahmins, his arms Kshatriyas, and his feet, well, feet are underappreciated. The Purusha Sukta doesn't describe a cannibalistic feast per se, but it is a divine act of disassembly, one where the consumption of flesh is metaphorically embedded in the creation of reality itself. In other words, the very bones of life were once part of a sacred body snack, served presumably with the sound of sitars echoing gently in the background. Even more intriguing is the Atharva Veda, a collection with a wilder, whisperier edge than its otherwise respectable Vedic siblings. In one chant, mention is made of ritually dismembering a human sacrifice. Now, scholars love to debate whether this was ever truly carried out, or if it was more of a high-concept spiritual metaphor. Think TED Talk meets sacrificial altar, but with more incense and fewer clickers. One particularly obscure rite, called the Purushameda, literally the human sacrifice, was said to symbolically offer humans to the gods. But here's the twist. All evidence suggests it was rarely, if ever, actually performed. Instead, humans were ceremonially bound and perhaps quite dramatically named as offerings like person who represents the echo of thunder on monsoon evenings, before being politely released and thanked for their time. In short, India's ancient ritual tradition may have flirted with the metaphysical idea of consuming a divine being's essence, but rarely did anyone actually go about roasting a priest. Still, the presence of these ideas in revered texts shows a spiritual appetite that went beyond rice cakes and into realms surreal and sublime. There's also the curious case of the Soma ritual. Soma, a milky, mysterious plant-based beverage believed to bestow immortality, spiritual insight, and perhaps mild digestive confusion. During the ritual, Soma was crushed, strained, and sipped with enormous reverence, often equated with a sacrificial offering itself. What is most charming and slightly odd about Soma is that it was both the offering and the deity. It's like pouring tea to honor tea while you sip it. The soma drinker, in participating, symbolically united with the divine, becoming both eater and eaten, host and offering. In this way, the metaphysical notion of cannibalism is not so much blood and gore. It's communion, transcendence through taste, the tongue as a priest, the stomach as a shrine. Quite the recipe. Now, sitting peacefully at the edge of sleep, one might muse. Perhaps the Vedic rituals, with their overlap of poetry and practicality, were less about actual feasting on flesh and more about digesting the universe itself. One verse, one mantra, one sacred morsel at a time. And so, the fires flicker low, and the hymns curl softly into the moonlit ether. But as night deepens and ancient chants drift into dreams, there is one more place to visit, a place where myth, madness, and a rather unfortunate conquistador converge. Let's wander there next, gently. Odd as it may seem, nothing says deep spiritual reverence, quite like seasoning human flesh in rosemary and thyme. But tonight, under the flickering shadows of flickering torchlight and reverent mumbling, we wander gently into Papua New Guinea, where ritual and repast often danced hand in hand, or at least bone in broth. Cue the Four People, a highland tribe swaddled by misty forests and emerald valleys. Until the mid-20th century, they practiced endocannibalism, a quiet, familial kind. Not the Hollywood villain brand where someone's being chased around with a fork, mind you. No, this was affectionate, comforting in its own way. A digestive eulogy, if you will. When a four-loved one passed away, their remains weren't carted off to lonely graveyards, but gathered back into the arms or stomachs of the family. The act of eating the dead was a sacred reverence, reunion disguised as meal. Flesh might be smoked or steamed in banana leaves, organs divided among daughters, and the brain, oh the brain, often given to women and children as a kind of spiritual communion. After all, doesn't Grandma always say, waste not, want not? Of course, this cherished tradition met a complicated fate. In the 1950s, doctors and researchers began noticing a strange neurodegenerative ailment spreading among the Fore, especially among the women and kids. Its name was kuru, meaning to shiver, fitting for a disease that left people trembling, laughing uncontrollably, and then sadly, unable to move at all. It turned out that the prions, those microscopic mischief makers lurking in human brain tissue, were quite disagreeable house guests, and so began the tragic unravelling of this ancestral dinner tribute. Still, in the foggy hush of the sleeping forest, it's poignant to remember that this wasn't grotesque. It was grief, transformed into ritual. Consuming the dead was their love letter in protein form, a custom crafted by generations who didn't separate the sacred from the everyday. Their ovens were altars, their recipes, remembrance. Further west across the Pacific, another tale of chewing and chewing over the past. In Fiji, where the air hums with salt and sweetness, cannibalism was once a badge of manhood, diplomacy, and interior decorating. Some chiefs believed that tangible evidence of their victories, like say, a human femur polished and lashed into a chair leg, brought prestige. And nothing whispered, "I'm in charge," quite like sipping kava in a bone-back stool while casually gnawing on last week's rival. It certainly beat PowerPoints. But even here, we note a curious rule. Not all bodies were edible. Cannibalism followed ritual frameworks. High-status foes were reserved for the chieftains, a sort of throne-room charcuterie, while commoners remained, well, off the menu. Puns not intended, but always welcome. There were also tales of the ceremonial omelette. No, really. Among the Wari people of Western Brazil, if someone died, the body wasn't buried. It was roasted, not in some hurried, barbaric way. No, gently, slowly, reverently. A final homage. Imagine a humid jungle clearing, smoke curling upward like a lullaby, as loved ones wept, chanted, and slowly allowed memory to mingle with flavor. It wasn't horror. It was healing, before modern grief counseling existed. To us today, these practices can sound as wild as a raccoon with a monocle. But in their time and place, they held sanity, spirituality, and sacred purpose. People sought to ingest the essence of another, to cling to their wisdom, their courage, their kindness, through liver and stew. Their rituals broke bread with mortality, not fearing it, but stirring it into the soup of life. Remember sleepily that Western culture isn't free from these kinds of symbol-laced suppers. Take communion in Christianity, the body and blood of Christ, represented through bread and wine. Cannibalism, light, you might call it, with grape juice and a cracker. The altar and the appetite, forever entwined. And now, as the ceremonial fire smoulders low and our bellies feel full of history, we drift onward. Somewhere, out beyond the jungly hush and the whispering bones, a group of Roman mystery cultists are about to prepare an odd little banquet. Let the candles dim, the crickets begin their sleepy symphony, and we float along to our next curious chapter. Close your eyes and picture honeyed figs warming on a brazier, the scent of rosemary curling through painted corridors, and somewhere in the distance, a lute being tuned terribly out of key. Welcome, soft traveller, to the myth-drenched dining halls of ancient Rome, where feasting wasn't just about polished mosaics and over-seasoned dormice. Sometimes, occasionally, banquets turned toward the ritual, and occasionally, ritual leaned a little too heavily into what we might now call culinary crime fiction. Tonight, we'll tiptoe through the shadows of Roman myth and early cult practice, where gods were hungry, very, very literally, and worshippers sometimes offered more than incense. First, let's exhale into the tale of Saturn. Not the planet, though it's nice to think of him floating out there with rings like crispy fried onion strings. No, Saturn the Roman god, the stern face-poster deity of harvest, time, and occasionally, paternal snacking. In his earliest iterations, Saturn was a figure borrowed from the Greek Kronos. Yes, the one who famously ate his children to prevent them from dethroning him. You've been warned. Roman Saturn was slightly less chompy, but his mythical past still crackled with whispers. According to poets and priestly scrolls, the Saturnalia festival, Rome's most rowdy holiday and the true spiritual predecessor to your neighborhood's most regrettable office Christmas party, was a time when the roles of masters and slaves reversed. Gifts were given, and public behavior was given a one-week pass to wander wildly off-leash. But earlier accounts, nestled like crumbling cookies in corners of Latin literature, suggest something darker at the roots of Saturn's cult. The Roman historian Macrobius, already half asleep in the 4th century, mentioned that in certain ancient rites, very ancient mind you, it was whispered that human sacrifices were once offered to Saturn. Allegedly, unlucky criminals were slain and burned in his honor as part of an older pre-civic tradition, before Rome became rather more fond of marble columns than murder. There is no solid archaeological evidence for widespread ritual cannibalism here, just soft sighs from old scrolls and one or two poetic hints that human offerings may have been, at one distant point, part of rituals later scrubbed clean with thyme and incense. And yet, that murky legend loomed just enough for Roman writers to worry over it. Ennius, one of Rome's early literary figures, draped his toga in concern over how Saturn's feast once drank blood. Later, Romans were both fascinated and mildly horrified by their own mythic roots, which is always a fun family dynamic. Imagine hosting Thanksgiving while whispering about how great-great-grandpa used to, eat people. But if Saturn's carnivorous legacy was more poetic than proven, a few obscure Roman cults tiptoed closer to the line. Enter the mystery cults, the spiritual subscription boxes of the ancient Mediterranean. You didn't just join, you were initiated. There were passwords, secret meetings, and possibly interpretive dances. One of the more opaque cults hinted at some surprisingly visceral practices. The Dionysian mysteries, imported from Greece and occasionally linked to wild feasts and blood rites, were suspected, accused at least, of encouraging debauchery and the drinking of blood, though historians now think this was probably just senatorial slander. Still, the strange persistence of ritual meals tied to blood, flesh, sacrifice, and symbolic rebirth haunted Roman spiritual life like sandalwood curling under a locked temple door. Even the Christians, in their early Roman years, were accused of cannibalism, thanks to misunderstood whispers of eating the body and blood of their god. Centurions, bless their bureaucratic little hearts, had trouble with metaphor. No matter how refined or religiously reserved the cult, Romans never stopped associating ritual with food. Even when actual meat wasn't on the menu, symbolic meals were everywhere. Imagine clay figurines shaped like body parts offered at temples, pig entrails split and studied like accidental lasagna, or banquets held in the name of the dead, complete with an empty seat, a goblet of wine, and a platter of wishes. But as cities shined and philosophy strolled through marbled forums, Rome's outright sacrificial feasts faded, or at least slipped carefully beneath veils of metaphor. The blood of the past became wine, and stories, like old recipes, were passed down, swapped out, and sweetened into legend. So no wide-eyed tourists stumbled into temples with human stews bubbling in bronze kettles. But behind every statue of Saturn, there lingered an old echo of a time before forks, before marble senators, when the gods might have wanted more than just admiration. And now, let the scent of myth fade gently. We'll take one more step soon, toward the chilling jungles of another empire, where ceremonial feasts dance right on the edge of the sacred and the stomach. Now, gently dim the lights of your mind and hush the rustlings of your busy thoughts. Tonight, we meander through an oddly scented corridor of ancient faith, where the menu occasionally featured you, me, or the neighbor down the alley, depending on theological scheduling. Yes, dear dream drifter, we are heading toward ritualistic cannibalism in cults, not in horror films or haunted tomes, but in the soft shuffle of history's sandal-covered footsteps. Let's begin, as all good nap-worthy tales do, in a temple carried on the smoke of incense and suspicion. We linger now in the shadowy corners of ancient Mesoamerica, where the Mexica, better known by their modern moniker, the Aztecs, once flourished with astounding precision, terrifying pageantry, and the occasional barbecue of cosmic proportions. But before we recoil, let us remember, in their cosmology, the universe required nourishment. The sun, poor overworked thing, craved blood the way we crave a cup of tea on a drizzly day. Some of the most sacred ceremonies, like the festival of Tlacaxipehualistli, say it thrice, and sleep shall surely find you, featured the sacrifice of war prisoners. But in certain rituals, the flesh wasn't just offered to the gods, it was given to the faithful. The body of the sacrificed was flayed, grilled, garnished, and shared among nobles. To consume the flesh was not an act of violence, it was divine communion. It was often compared to consuming the god Totec himself, a deity of renewal and rebirth, forever redressed in the skin of transformation. Rather poetic, if unsettlingly chewy. Of course, they weren't just eating to pass the time. This was theology, not tailgate. The notion of embodied divinity tasted very literal in these times. To partake in devout dining was to assimilate the gods themselves. Imagine that, your favorite deity becoming a mid-afternoon snack. Far away and long ago, nestled in the mystery-fogged isles of Polynesia, we find more tales, whispered on sea breezes and passed through tattoo-inked generations, of cannibalistic rites in tribal rituals. On the islands of Fiji and beyond, ritual cannibalism was not merely a practice, it was an inheritance, a symbolic claiming of strength. Eating an enemy was believed to transfer their mana, a spiritual electricity of sorts, into your own being. Imagine digesting someone's resume to gain their skills. Convenient, though deeply frowned upon in today's HR policies. But again, this was not wanton carnage. The act was steeped in hierarchy and ceremony, often limited to appointed priests or warriors of great standing. And no ketchup was involved, which tells us something about intent and dignity. Meanwhile, in classical tales from the Greeks, those philosophical loafers lounging in togas under olive trees, we encounter mythic cannibalism with dramatic flair. The story of Tantalus, who served his own son at a divine dinner party, if you can imagine the worst potluck in Olympus, is not just mythic horror. It's a cautionary tale about hubris, morality, and why you don't mess with the pantry of the gods. One might call it metaphor meets menu. But cannibalism was not equally accepted across all Greek cults. In mystery religions, such as those of Dionysus, the metaphorical consumption of divinity was more common than actual flesh chewing. There were theatrical reenactments involving raw meat, ecstatic dance, and possibly an awkward wine spill or two, but little to no real ingestion of personhood, unless you're counting metaphor, which sometimes delights in eating its own tail. Stepping softly into the Roman Empire, we find early Christians occasionally being accused by confused or hostile pagans of ritual cannibalism, an entirely awkward misunderstanding of the Eucharist. "This is my body," Christ said symbolically, but to an outsider listening in on whispers behind a curtain, well, let's just say optics matter. And so, time and again, across oceans and empires, the idea that consuming flesh could bind you to the divine flickered like a candle shadow on temple walls. Sometimes it was symbolic, sometimes it was succulent, but always it was densely packed with meaning, ritual, identity, transcendence, and perhaps the human need to make the sacred part of oneself by any means necessary. Now, dear listener, your pillow may begin to feel as sacred as the altar of any sun-worshipping empire. Tomorrow, or at least the next chapter, there are stranger feasts still to mention, where flesh was not always food, but symbol, punishment, even power made edible. But for now, let the candles flicker out, let your mind marinate in dreams, and we'll wander softly through the smoke and mystery. When you're ready, under the moon-drenched skies of antiquity, where the stars once whispered directly into the ears of scribes, lie the remnants of a civilization so ancient, its bricks were sunbaked before the invention of the pyramid scheme. Welcome to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and quite possibly the origin of divine dining. Now, when most people think temples, they imagine golden shrines, serious chanting, and the occasional smouldering incense, an atmosphere of great solemnity. But in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, temples weren't just homes for the gods. Oh no, they were bustling buffet-style operations where feeding the divine was a full-time job. Think less holy sanctum and more celestial room service. You see, Mesopotamian gods were not abstract or aloof. They were hungry, and I mean annoyed by empty plate kind of hungry. The people of the Tigris and Euphrates plains built elaborate temple kitchens where daily meals were prepared for wooden statues believed to embody living deities. The logic was simple. Gods gave humans food. Humans gave gods food. Everyone stayed fed and, most importantly, on speaking terms. Each meal involved a ritual known as Nu, which amusingly translates as invitation. The deity statue, seated serenely at a miniature banquet table, was offered lovingly prepared meals of meat, bread, fish, milk, dates, and occasionally beer, because eternal omnipotence pairs nicely with a cold fermented barley beverage. High-ranking priests, acting as divine waitstaff, laid out the feast with the precision of a five-star restaurant, often accompanied by music and incense to really set the mood. After a period of dignified divine chewing, which was mostly silent, what with the wooden mouths and all, the gods were expected to have consumed the essence of the meal, which just so happened to leave the physical leftovers available for the priests. Yes, my sleepy traveller, we've arrived at what some scholars cheekily refer to as holy leftovers. That's right, the temple staff got to eat what the gods didn't touch, which conveniently was everything. This wasn't an accidental perk, it was an institutional snack plan. The food, now infused with divine blessing, nourished mortals with heaven's own seasoning. There were, of course, some rules. Not all portions were equally purloined. Certain cuts, like the tongue or the organs of a sacrificed animal, might be reserved strictly for the deity. Though one must marvel, what does an eternal god require a goat's liver for? Perhaps it's like spiritual iron intake. Who's to say? Interestingly, priests weren't the only ones munching on divine scraps. On special feast days, the rest of the population might receive portions too. Think of it as the world's first holy potluck. Citizens would clamour for blessed meat, much as modern humans chase food trucks. Only this one had more chanting and celestial vibes. It's important to note, however, that this wasn't cannibalism, not even in the loosest, ritualistic sense. Unlike South American or oceanic rites, where human flesh was consumed in sacred contexts, Mesopotamian divine dinners were meat-based but animal in theme. Even in sacrifices, humans weren't on the menu, at least not in recorded Akkadian. Humans were certainly offered to the gods on occasion, but that's a rather different kettle of omens. Still, some texts whisper of darker practices in the chaos of conquest or famine. A Babylonian tablet or two suggests that, in the most desperate of times, people considered horrifying options. But these were aberrations, not rituals. Sacred dining remained chiefly a matter between animal and altar, god and grill, priest and plate. From a dreamy distance, one might find this ritual oddly comforting. A pact between people and gods, woven through daily bread and roasted lamb, reminds us that even the divine might like a good meal and a little company, even if silent and elaborately bejeweled. So the next time you set a plate at the table for a guest, remember, you're continuing a tradition stretching back over 5 millennia, hosting someone with care, perhaps letting them sample your best wares before nabbing the last bite yourself. And as the temple fires smoulder low and the sacred cutlery is cleaned for tomorrow's feast, we'll quietly follow the scent of spice and incense into the next shadowed hall of mystery, where whispers of blood and belief drift gently through the stone corridors of devotion. Long after candles burn low and ghostly echoes curl through cloister walls, archaeologists creep into the dirt like bedtime beetles, brushing away centuries of sleep from the bones of bygone believers. Tonight, dream gently as we descend beneath Europe's oldest churches, where whispered legends and skeletal secrets await with a polite but bony grin. Let us wander to the shadowed heart of Europe in the late Middle Ages, a time of plagues, pilgrimages, and boundless belief, where faith hummed louder than reason, and a relic could outshine a king. It was also, perhaps surprisingly, a time when certain bones were more than just bones. They were sacred snacks, but politely so. You see, medieval Europe had that peculiar penchant for relics, the physical remains of saints, martyrs, and the very holiest of the holy. A pinky bone from St. Cecilia, miraculous, a molar from St. Lawrence, a sacred treasure, a knuckle said to belong to John the Baptist, divine real estate, and hotly contested. Possessing such relics could make a modest chapel into a bustling pilgrimage hub, and a gold mine in woolen pilgrims. But beyond adoration sometimes, albeit rarely, there were whispers, delicate as veils in draughty cathedrals, that relics could not only bless a parish, but nourish it. This brings us to the French town of Aymet in the 14th century, where a scandalous tale tiptoes out of the parchment. A bedridden peasant woman claimed that consuming a soup infused with powdered same bone, not to be too poetic, cured her goiter. Was it faith? Was it calcium? Was it early Catholic calcium? Hard to say. But either way, monastery kitchens began to stir peculiar brews. Not every churchman was thrilled about this. The official word from the Vatican was a diplomatic mix of stern eyebrows and theological shoulder shrugging. Bones were to be venerated, not ingested. Yet, tucked into apothecaries and whispered through candlelight, the practice persisted in tiny doses, a soupçon of saint, a peppering of piety. Strictly for healing, of course, and only in cases of spiritual emergency. Now, consider the case of the incorruptibles, those saints whose bodies refused to decay and thus justified more than a few creepy pilgrimages. Some believed these preservation miracles radiated divine energy. And here is where the line between admiration and absorption blurred ever so sleepily. Certain medieval monks, the very picture of piousness, with sandals, scrolls, and suspiciously rosy cheeks, reported visions that told them to consume small, sanctified portions of the incorruptibles. It was not cannibalism, as the ancients had practiced it, more like edible reverence. Of course, mostly it was symbolic. The Eucharist itself had been navigating the fine line between metaphor and divine munchies for centuries, with theologians bickering politely over whether that wafer was symbolically or literally Jesus. Fun fact: the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 boldly declared, transubstantiation it is, basically the spiritual equivalent of calling dibs on the divine charcuterie. Meanwhile, in rural communities where Latin prayers melted into folk medicine, human remains were sometimes used more. Practically, ground skull powder, called mumia, was believed to cure anything from headaches to heartbreak, depending on the vintage. Imported from Egypt, or so the label claimed, it was often just local bones with a sprinkle of commerce. Apothecaries would sometimes blend it into wine, which might explain both the cure and the hangover. It's worth imagining the strangeness. Sitting in a candlelit chapel, iron bells grumbling low above you, sipping saintly stew in the hopes it might cure your failing eyes or barren belly. There's something heartbreakingly human in that image. A people clinging to the tangible remnants of holiness, drawing literal sustenance from their beliefs. And as we drift further into this candle smoke memory, we must be gentle with judgment. These were acts of desperation wrapped in devotion, taken not in hunger for flesh, but in hunger for hope. In a world barely held together by belief and barley, the bones of the righteous were considered the last sturdy thing around. But all bones break eventually, even sacred ones. Sleep now, soft historian. We will finish our journey where ritual ends and reverence lingers, in the hush of the final altar, where myth and memory entwine. Now that the table has been set, the fires have been stoked, and the ancestors called, we find ourselves at the final course of our rather odd and ancient banquet. Steady your blanket like a noble toga, and let's drift slowly, one last time, into the warm, spiced kitchens of history, where divine appetites and human rituals once collided in the most peculiar of ways. Much like the crackling embers of a ceremonial pyre, the topic of ritualistic cannibalism fades into the night, smoky and strange, equal parts revealing and revolting. But as we settle our minds down like shepherds under a Mesopotamian moon, let's remember the curious little truth behind so many things we've whispered through time. Humans will do the oddest things when fear and faith sit down for dinner. In societies as distant as the Aztec Empire and as close to Rome's curious corners, ritualistic cannibalism wasn't simply about meat, it was about meaning. Take the Aztecs, for instance. To European invaders, their sacrificial feasts of heart and limb were terrifying. But to the Aztecs, this was reverence on a platter, a way to commune with gods who sweat blood to keep the stars turning. Ingesting flesh wasn't mere hunger, it was holiness. Bit gruesome, yes, but in their cultural context, it was like sipping communion wine, if the wine happened to have bones. Even in ancient China, where philosophies tended to prefer harmony over hors d'oeuvres, stories lingered of filial piety so intense, it occasionally included offering up a bit of thigh meat to a sick parent. Now that's commitment, and possibly an uncomfortable dinner conversation. Thank you, dear. The soup is lovely. Is that you? But as empires aged and pantheons fell quiet, the fork turned away from flesh. Rituals got cleaner. Gods, more metaphorical. The idea of consuming the divine shifted from the physical to the symbolic. Christianity, for example, took the bread and wine route, which, let's be honest, is far easier to plate. Through the years, anthropologists nibbled the edges of this topic with delicate forks of academic restraint. Was it hunger, desperation, or spiritual digestion? Likely a blend. In Papua New Guinea, the Fort people performed endocannibalism, eating one's dead relatives not out of barbarism, but out of affection, duty, and respect. Grandma's final resting place was within the living family. Her wisdom, now part of your ribs, sentimental in a chewy sort of way. Unfortunately, this practice contributed to the spread of kuru, a disease not unlike mad cow, only this one made you laugh while your nervous system unraveled. A grim joke from nature's menu. So the practice, thoughtful though it was, faded away, replaced by more sanitary rituals like funerals, memorial stones, and awkward toasts. And what of today? Cannibalism survives only in footnotes, nightmares, and the occasional sensational news clipping. And yet, something about its ancient echo lingers in the way we speak of devotion, of sacrifice, of giving oneself completely. It's all very poetic, when no one's wielding a ceremonial obsidian knife. In the end, dear dreamer, ritualistic cannibalism wasn't so much about flesh as it was about connection, whether to gods, ancestors, loved ones, or the grand cosmic rhythm that binds the living and the dead, like one long braided intestine of meaning. And now, as the final coals grow soft and the distant drums quiet to a heartbeat's whisper, we tuck away the last napkin of history. The night stretches out like a Nazca line, mysterious and steady, and so does sleep. Close your eyes and breathe in the ancient air, spiced with sandalwood, smoke, and just a tasteful hint of historical irony. Tonight, you dined across time. Tomorrow, we'll eat something a little less chewy. But for now, drift softly, wrapped in the strange warmth of old stories and older taboos. Good night, curious one. May your dreams be peaceful and entirely vegetarian.